Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And in this lecture, we're going to learn about the fire eaters. We're going to discuss the doughfaces. We're going to talk about blue hats. We're going to learn about a giant snake, and we're going to meet 6 mighty armies. And we're going to follow that outline right up above my head as we learn about the events leading up to and the initial stages of the American Civil War. We're going to start with these guys. Fire eaters. Now, the fire eaters were a group of prominent Southerners. They were planters, they were businessmen, they were lawyers, they were politicians. Some of them were scientists. I mean, Edmund Ruffin there on the left was an agronomist who lived in Southern Virginia. And the fire eaters were a group of very intelligent men. They were very well read, they were very well educated, and they built this rational, logical argument that led to something that was completely insane. And their argument was basically this: based on the founding documents of the United States, based on Thomas Jefferson, Thomas Paine, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, John Locke, Baron de Montesquieu, based on all of that material, the fire eaters concluded that the founding principles of the United States were inimically opposed to the concept of American slavery. And in this, they are absolutely correct. When you can't build a nation based on the concept that all men are created equal, you can't build a government dedicated to defending the natural rights of its citizens, and at the same time, enslave 20% of your own population. These two ideas are completely opposed to one another. Thus, the fire eaters argued that the logic of the United States itself will lead it to the conclusion that slavery must be destroyed, not just within the United States, but in all of its neighbors as well. And again, fire eaters are not wrong on this. But here's where we go off the rails, because the fire eaters are intense racists, and they are fervent defenders of American slavery. So to the fire eaters, if the choice comes between the United States and American slavery, they're going to keep American slavery. Thus, to defend American slavery, the fire eaters argued, the Southern states must break away from the United States. The Southern slave states must form their own country. But, the fire eaters went on, it's not just that the Southerners need to break away and form their own country, but the North has to be taught a lesson not to meddle with slavery and not to meddle with the internal affairs of the South. And the only way to do that is through military force, through armed political violence. Hence, the fire eaters built this argument that the United States is fundamentally opposed to slavery. The only way to preserve slavery is to get rid of the United States. And to do that, we must break away from the United States, and this breakup must be violent. In other words, throughout the 1850s, you have these fire eaters arguing we should welcome a coming civil war. The fire eaters are crisscrossing the South, giving these fiery speeches, presenting their argument, which does make a kind of sense, saying that we need to fight a bloody civil war against the North to defend slavery, and if your livelihood depends on slavery at all, you will join us and welcome us in the war that will come. And that's what they talk about. War. That's what they want to happen. In fact, Edmund Ruffin, he's one of the more prominent fire eaters right there. Edmund Ruffin writes kind of this science fiction novel in the 1850s where he predicts that a civil war will happen in the year 1868, in which the South will rise up against an abolitionist president. And he even identifies the abolitionist president. He says it's going to be this guy named William Seward. And William Seward was the former governor of New York. He was a New York senator. And he was a prominent and well-known abolitionist. And Edmund Ruffin argued that the South would not accept William Seward as president and would rise up, triumph, defeat the North, and establish a utopia of slavery and go on to conquer Latin America. But anyway, all of that was science fiction. But during this period, you have the fire eaters. They are Southern secessionists. They are promoting armed rebellion, and they say that the Civil War needs to happen. And they're giving all of these speeches during a very chaotic period in American history, a decade known as the chaotic 1850s, where the existing political structures basically completely fell apart in the United States. And a lot of really crazy things happened in the 1850s, and I'm only going to sort of pick the 4 main ones. You know, Bleeding Kansas, the Brook-Sumner clash, the Dred Scott decision, and John Brown's raid. And I'm going to start with the crisis of Bleeding Kansas. What happened with Bleeding Kansas? It starts with the idea to build a transcontinental railroad. And to do that, they have to have a couple new states in the West, Nebraska and Kansas. But Nebraska and Kansas, it's decided, are going to vote internally whether they want to enter the United States as a free state or a slave state. And this is an idea called popular sovereignty. It sounds pretty good, but it ends up being a terrible idea. Now, Nebraska joins the United States. They just vote to be a free state. Nebraska, not a problem. It's Kansas where the problem comes in. They're getting ready to hold a vote to whether they're going to enter the United States as a free state or a slave state when they are invaded by a group of heavily armed pro-slavery militias coming out of Missouri and invading western and central Kansas. And these pro-slavery militias are doing so in order to sway the popular vote, to threaten people, to intimidate people, to stuff ballot boxes. And essentially, they're trying to steal the election and create Kansas as a slave state. So it'll sort of join the Southern Rebellion when it happens. And to counter these people, a group of heavily armed radical abolitionists then proceed to invade Kansas from the east and from the north. These hardcore abolitionists get these secret shipments of rifles in these crates that are marked Bibles, and they're sent by a guy called Henry Beecher. Hence, all of these guns all over Kansas become known as Beecher's Bibles. And Henry Beecher is quite famous. His sister writes Uncle Tom's Cabin. So throughout Kansas, throughout the 1850s, you have the pro-slavery people fighting the abolitionists in these sort of roving gun battles in this crazy Wild West all over Kansas. And it's so chaotic that Kansas ends up with actually two capitals. There is the anti-slavery capital in Topeka, and then there is the pro-slavery capital in Lecompton. So you have two rival factions in Kansas, each fighting each other. The territorial governor of Kansas appeals to the president, and he's like, this is crazy. We've got like dozens of armed men riding around the state, shooting people, murdering people, lynching people. This is absolutely crazy. Please help us, federal government. And the federal government springs into action and does absolutely nothing. Because one of the reasons that the 1850s are so chaotic is that there is a complete lack of any leadership coming from the presidency. Here are the three presidents of the 1850s. Millard Fillmore, Franklin Pierce, and James Buchanan. These are all incredibly weak men. They're not strong leaders. First off, there's Millard Fillmore, the last Whig president. And he only became president on the death of Zachary Taylor. And Zachary Taylor picked Millard Fillmore to be his vice president because they didn't want a repeat of the whole John Tyler situation from the 1840s. So Millard Fillmore was picked because he was weak, because he was relatively unknown. And when he kind of accidentally becomes president, no one respects him. He has no real power. He has no real influence. And for 2 years, he's this kind of non-entity in the White House as the Democrats prepare for their big, strong pro-slavery candidate. And they think they have it in Franklin Pierce, this charismatic, attractive war hero from the Mexican War. He's elected in 1852. They think he's going to give strong leadership. He's very pro-South. But then they slowly discover that Franklin Pierce is a massive and raging alcoholic. Franklin Pierce is deeply traumatized. On his way to his inauguration, he watches as his only son is sucked into the wheels of a locomotive, and it kind of breaks his mind, and it definitely shatters the sanity of his wife, who spends the next 4 years dressed all in black, hanging out in the third floor of the White House. But Franklin Pierce turns to drink, and he drinks heavily for 4 years, essentially being a complete and total failure as a president. People come to him and they're like, President Pierce, Americans are murdering each other in Kansas. You got to do something. And President Pierce proceeds to do absolutely nothing. And at the end of 4 years, he's completely broken down. He will eventually die, unsurprisingly, of cirrhosis. But then they finally, in their desperation, turn to James Buchanan. James Buchanan is this incredibly old politician, and he's the last surviving member of Andrew Jackson's old cabinet. And they're thinking, James Buchanan has wanted to be president for 20 years. He's got the last sort of fragments of the glamour of Andrew Jackson about him. James Buchanan is our man. And they elect James Buchanan, and James Buchanan is an absolute failure. James Buchanan is simply too old. He's too senile. He's out of touch. He would much rather just go to parties and talk about French and Spanish wines and just kind of, go have a nap on the porch in the afternoon. He is simply too old to be the kind of president needed to fix the country in the 1850s. Absolutely, all of these men are complete disasters as president. They're ineffective, they're indecisive, that's Millard Fillmore. They're alcoholics, that's Franklin Pierce. Or they're just senile and out of touch, that's, James Buchanan. They're weak men, they're poor leaders, and they're terrible presidents. And one of the things that gets tossed around, one of the main insults that people give to James Buchanan is that he is a doughface. In fact, they're all, doughfaces. And a doughface was an insult of the day. It meant that somebody whose face could be shaped like bread dough. They're soft, they're weak, there's no real substance to them. They're just weak people, they're bad leaders, they're poor presidents. And James Buchanan becomes known as the king of the doughfaces. He's just absolutely senile. He's really fat. And doughface takes on another meaning because of James Buchanan. People start to call Northerners who are pro-slavery and are enamored of the South, they start to call all of these people doughfaces. James Buchanan is from Pennsylvania. He's not a Southerner, but he's so pro-slavery and he's so infatuated with the South that people just claim, oh, he's just a doughface. He says he's from the North, but he's really a Southerner. And you could just kind of shape him like bread dough. Worthless, weak presidents. But this is the type of leadership that people get used to in the 1850s as the political structures in the country start to fall apart. And we're going to continue with our discussion of the corrosive and destructive situation in the 1850s. And we come to the Brook-Sumner clash, and that's it right up there. And the Brook-Sumner clash comes out of these debates in Congress about what to do about bleeding Kansas. And we have Charles Sumner, that's him on the floor being beaten right up above me. Charles Sumner is a Northern politician, he's an abolitionist. And on the floor of the US Senate, Charles Sumner gives this very passionate speech against slavery. And he says it's because of the evilness of slavery is why we have this terrible problem in Kansas. And it's people who are trying to promote and expand slavery in the United States that have turned Kansas into this Wild West war zone. And he said, you should not defend slavery. And he puts all these sexual connotations in his speech. And basically one of the things he says is, the reason you Southerners defend slavery so much is basically just because you like to rape slave women. And it is an outrageous speech. The whole Congress just flies into an uproar about it. And after the speech, Charles Sumner is at his desk, on the floor of the US Senate writing his notes when he's approached by a Southerner from, South Carolina, of course, called Preston Brooks. And Preston Brooks says, I took great exception to your speech. You insulted the South. You insulted the people of South Carolina. You insulted my cousin, who is a senator who you were also addressing at the time. And I demand that you take back those words. And Charles Sumner went, absolutely not. I won't do it. So Preston Brooks lifts his cane and just starts beating Senator Sumner down on the floor of the US Senate. And his cane is made of a tropical hardwood. So every time he smashes it into Charles Sumner's face, blood sprays across the floor of the US Senate. And he drags him to the ground. The fellow senators rush forward to help Charles Sumner, but Preston Brooks' friend pulls a gun on the floor of the US Senate and says, let them be, as Preston Brooks attempts to kill a sitting American senator on the floor of the US Senate. And his tropical hardwood cane actually shatters in the middle of all of this. And Charles Sumner is beaten terribly. He's damn near killed. It cracks his skull open. And eventually they're able to part the two people, but each side views Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner as a great hero of their cause. To the South, Preston Brooks is a hero. He defended the honor of the South. He defended the honor of Southerners. He attacked this man who made all these scurrilous sexual innuendos about Southerners, and he is to be honored and respected. In fact, Preston Brooks is going to die a few years later of the croup, and he's given a hero's funeral in the South. But to the North, Charles Sumner is this martyr. He's a hero who stood up and told the truth. And the Southerners just couldn't handle the truth. And they said that is what Southern chivalry really is. It is argument with clubs. Southerners can't intellectually or morally defend slavery. Slavery is just brute violence enforced with clubs. And Charles Sumner never really recovers from getting his skull cracked open. The people of Massachusetts leave his seat empty for years. And anytime somebody's giving this fiery speech against slavery, they turn and point to Charles Sumner's empty seat and says, there sits the product of Southern chivalry. Congress is falling apart and is unable to deal with the issue of slavery or with bleeding Kansas. So the presidency has failed, Congress is falling apart, and eventually the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court says, okay, we are going to solve the slavery issue. We're going to solve the issue of bleeding Kansas. If the presidency's failed, if Congress has failed, it's up to the Supreme Court to do it. And the case they pick to finally settle the issue of slavery is the Dred Scott v. Sandford case. And they settle this in 1857. That on the left is Dred Scott. Now, the Dred Scott case at this point was 11 years old. And the Dred Scott case involved a lawsuit between Dred Scott and the Sandford family, the people who ostensibly, owned him. And Dred Scott had been the slave of an army doctor who had spent a lot of time in Illinois and Wisconsin. And Dred Scott had lived in the North. He had married a woman. He'd had kids. And when the person who basically owned him, when that army doctor died, the rest of that family said, okay, you're a slave, so you need to come back down south. And now we own you. But Dred Scott argued that he had spent so long in a free state that makes him free. And he took them to court. And the abolitionists were paying all of his court case because, slavery's evil. And this case had gone back and forth for 11 years. And finally, the Supreme Court decides to hear the Dred Scott case because they are going to fix the issue of slavery in America. So they pick up the Dred Scott decision and they read it. They study the case. People make their decisions and then they announce their conclusions. And the Supreme Court releases the Dred Scott decision, which has gone down in American history as one of the worst decisions ever given by the Supreme Court. The Dred Scott decision, 1857, says basically Dred Scott is a slave because he is African American, and basically, due to our reading of the Constitution, African Americans cannot really be American citizens. So there aren't really free states or slave states. There's no division. If slavery is legal in one state and it's condoned by the Constitution, then slavery is legal in all states. And the entire country reeled from the hubris and arrogance of the Dred Scott decision. They're like, what are you talking about? There's no way the North is going to permit a decision like this. And they actually take the Dred Scott decision to newly elected President Buchanan. They're like, can you believe what the Supreme Court just did? This is outrageous. And James Buchanan, sitting on his warm porch, kind of nods and says, oh yes, well they told me they were going to do this beforehand, and I actually helped write part of the decision. The entire country reels over the Dred Scott decision. That the decision to re-enslave a free family of the North. And this is the point where a lot of abolitionists are like, the government cannot be reformed. These slavery Southerners have so twisted and distorted our government that there's no way to really save the United States government. You've got fire eaters giving these angry speeches all over the South. They're re-enslaving free people. They're beating U.S. senators on the floor of the Senate. It is time to do drastic action. And the man who takes this drastic action is Captain John Brown. Captain John Brown was one of the leaders of one of those abolitionist militias in Bleeding, Kansas. There he is right there with his epic, incredible beard. If you get a beard like that, it makes you bulletproof. And anyway, John Brown arrives at the decision that the United States government is intensely corrupt and the Southerners have twisted and distorted the founding principles of the United States. Ergo, drastic action is needed. So John Brown decides he is going to trigger a massive slave uprising. He and his family and his sons and his fellow abolitionists are going to get together. They're going to get the old crew from Bleeding, Kansas back together, and they're going to storm a federal arsenal. And the arsenal they picked to storm is in a place called Manassas. So it's called Harper's Ferry. and they're going to capture this huge pile of federal guns and muskets and artillery and gunpowder, and they're going to grab it and they're going to head south into Virginia, and they're going to trigger a great slave uprising. And all of these African Americans are going to join them, and John Brown is going to be like, Christ is with me, I'm on the right side, and he is going to create this huge slave revolt that will destroy slavery in the South. And he launches this in 1859. This is John Brown's raid. John Brown takes his crew from Kansas. They attack the federal arsenal. They force their way inside. Strangely enough, the first person they surprise is a slave, a guy who's basically loading a wagon in the yard. And they ride in and they pull out their guns. And they're like, join us, brother. And the African-American guy basically starts yelling an alarm because all of these crazy Wild West people just rode in. He starts yelling an alarm, alarm. So they shoot him. So the irony of ironies, John Brown's raid, where he's going to free the enslaved Americans, begins with the murder of an African-American. But the raid very badly goes it goes south. Things don't work the way they want. The local slaves don't rise up and spontaneously join them. They end up barricading themselves in the building. The alarm is raised quite quickly, and it reaches a young army colonel who has basically recently returned from Texas. And they hear about this attack on the federal arsenal, and he basically grabs whatever troops he can find. And in this case, it's a group of Marines. And he's actually an Army officer, so he really has no real authority over these Marines because they're Navy. But they listen to him anyway. He convinces them to join him, and together they storm the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry. They engage in this huge shootout with John Brown's crew, and they end up capturing John Brown. And they defeat this great slave uprising that he's supposed to trigger. And the man who captured John Brown was a colonel by the name of Robert E. Lee. And they grab John Brown. They want a show trial. They want a big trial to go on. They want to make an example out of John Brown. But the problem is, this is exactly what John Brown wants. They give a huge trial to John Brown. He stands up and he turns his own trial, and he's clearly guilty. He turns his own trial into a podium where he can denounce the evil and violence of slavery. He can say, all of this is terrible. America is a sinful place. And there is the quote from John Brown right there. I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land can never be purged away but with blood. And John Brown ends up being absolutely correct. It's not even a year later that the Civil War breaks out. And if you go to the Kansas State Capitol today, they have this incredible mural on their wall called Tragic Prelude, where John Brown, holding a Bible in one hand and a Beecher's Bible in the other, predicts the coming of the Civil War. The political structures have completely and utterly broken down. So the issue of slavery has destroyed the old Whig Party. It's torn the Democrats apart. People are fighting on the floor of the U.S. Senate. The presidents are a series of weak, alcoholic, out-of-touch old men. The Supreme Court is issuing these absolutely crazy decisions. The entire political structure is deadlocked and disintegrating fast. But a new political structure starts to form, and it starts to form in Wisconsin in 1854. What happens in Wisconsin in 1854 is the remains of these old abolitionist parties, the Liberty Party, the Free Soilers, a group of abolitionist Whigs, completely form a new political party, combining most of the old ideas of the Whig Party with this strong anti-slavery message. To honor Thomas Jefferson, they give it a new name. They call it the Republican Party. And they aim to run a presidential candidate in 1856. And they do. They run the very famous explorer, a guy called John C. Fremont. And they end up, doing pretty well. I mean, look, they capture 33% of the vote in the North. And while Fremont is defeated by James Buchanan, that's because people thought, James Buchanan had like the last glamour of Andrew Jackson. But the Republicans are a growing force in the North. And you can see in that cartoon in the upper left, this is a Southern cartoon about these new Republicans. And it's talking about all the freaks and the weirdos who joined the Republican Party. Drunks, women libbers. She's got a short skirt and she's smoking a cigarette. Catholics, tutting schoolmarms, and of course the incredibly racist cartoon of an African American, all of these people standing in front of John Fremont. But while John Fremont failed in 1856, the Republicans continue to become more popular. They continue to gain strength with their message of a strong government, anti-slavery. And if they're not going to abolish slavery, they will at least limit it. And emerging out of this new Republican Party is a Senate debate between Stephen Douglas and a new upcoming member of the Republican Party, Abraham Lincoln. And while Abraham Lincoln loses his senatorial race, the speeches of the Lincoln-Douglas debate give him a national platform in which to speak. And in 1860, the Republicans run Abraham Lincoln as their candidate. And just as they're doing so, just as this new Republican Party is giving forth this relatively unknown candidate, Abraham Lincoln, at the exact same time, the old Democratic Party completely shatters. It doesn't just break into two, it shatters into three different parts. And in 1860, you have three different Democratic candidates. You have four candidates for president. You've got Lincoln, you've got Breckinridge, you've got Bell, and you've got Douglas, Abraham Lincoln's old nemesis in Illinois. And it's absolutely mad. All the existing political structures shatter. You have four candidates, and once the dust clears, Abraham Lincoln has been elected president. Abraham Lincoln wins a sweep of the North. He has a strong limiting slavery message. He's got all these old Whig ideas, which were good ideas, even back in the day of Henry Clay and Alexander Hamilton. And Abraham Lincoln doesn't win a single vote in the South. He is a totally Northern president. And the South is absolutely apoplectic at his election. And the fire eaters pound their pulpits. They're like, we told you this was going to happen. We told you that the United States was going to turn against slavery. And here we have a photograph of the inauguration of President Abraham Lincoln. You can just kind of make him out right there in the center. And one of the people that Abraham Lincoln picks to be part of his cabinet, he appoints him as Secretary of State, is the old abolitionist William Seward. He picks William Seward to be his Secretary of State, the guy who gave that fantastic speech back in 1850 about the evils of slavery and how good Americans cannot be good Christians or good Americans and defend slavery. The fire eaters go absolutely mad. They're like, we told you this was going to happen. We told you this was going to happen. The United States is going to turn against slavery. Edmund Ruffin is absolutely beside himself. He says, I told you this was going to happen. In fact, I even identified the man who would trigger the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, who cares about that? Edmund Ruffin pounds on pulpits and complains about William Seward. And during this transition, after the election of 1860, you have states start to move towards secession. States start to openly talk war, war, war. And in the last days of the presidency of James Buchanan, interesting things start happening. Because you see, James Buchanan's Secretary of War is a guy named John Floyd, and that's him right up above me. John Floyd is in command of the military and the Navy. And as these southern states start to move towards war, as they start to assemble, secessionist councils, and as they start to decide whether to leave the United States, John Floyd starts to send tens of thousands of rifles south. John Floyd will send over 250,000 small arms into these federal arsenals in the South, absolutely knowing that the moment these states break away from the United States, they're going to seize all of these guns. John Floyd sends almost the entire military stockpile of the United States to the southern states. Over 150,000 rifled muskets are sent to the South. Hundreds of thousands of pounds of gunpowder. Hundreds of artillery pieces. He takes the Navy's most powerful warship, one of the Navy's most powerful warships, a ship named the USS Merrimack, and he makes sure he sends it to a southern port, Norfolk, so it can undergo repairs. I mean, the repairs were scheduled anyway, but they could have waited. And why would you give a state that's about to break away from the United States like one of the most powerful ships in the Navy? And the ships that are in really good shape, he sends them on a tour of Asia, so that when war does break out, they end up on the other side of the world. So this leads to one of the great ironies of the Civil War, that the rebel army that will eventually fight against the federal government was largely initially armed and equipped by the federal government. And people know, this is happening. They try to bring up John Floyd on treason charges because he's sending thousands of weapons south. And there's even a whistleblower in Texas, this army colonel named Robert E. Lee, who says, I have like 50 men in my outposts. Why have we received 1,000 muskets? Why is the local general in Texas, a guy called Twigg, if I remember correctly, why is General Twigg openly talking about what rank he will have in a new Confederate army? Why is General Twigg talking to secessionists and fire eaters about how many weapons can we get from the federal government before we break away? You've got to stop this, James Buchanan. Robert E. Lee actually tries to meet with James Buchanan and tell him that all of this crazy stuff is going on, but James Buchanan just wants to have a nap. He just wants to have a nap in the afternoon. And there are two waves of breakaway states. You have two waves of secession. You've got the first wave, South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas. All of these states break away before the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln, because the other group of states, they want to see what's going to happen, once Lincoln gets into power. And once Lincoln gets inaugurated, once he's President Lincoln, he gets William Seward as his Secretary of State. Abraham Lincoln starts to say, no, we are not going to let these states break away. Abraham Lincoln is not senile. He's not alcoholic. He's not, ineffectual. He is a strong leader. And he likens his situation to Andrew Jackson in the nullification crisis. He's like, Andrew Jackson wouldn't let these states break away, and I'm not going to either. And Lincoln starts to make this very fiery rhetoric. No state is allowed to leave the United States. And this triggers a second wave of states to secede. In fact, they were already, willing to go. This is Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee. Missouri starts to make moves to break away, and they're stopped from seceding by a very intelligent army captain named Nathaniel Lyon. Nathaniel Lyon hears that a group of secessionists and fire eaters are going to meet in Springfield, and without any real authority, he gathers up a bunch of army cavalry, storms over to Springfield, and up and arrests them. And basically the actions of this quick-thinking army captain prevent Missouri from joining the Confederacy. Maryland starts to talk about joining the Confederacy, and Lincoln just up and floods the state with federal troops, meaning that there will be no discussion of secession. Kentucky actually tries to stay neutral. Kentucky's like, well, we're not going to back the federal government, but we're not going to join the Confederacy. And they try to negotiate a series of compromises through a guy called Senator Crittenden, but it's not going to happen, because you see the fire eaters are firmly in control in the South. They're being listened to, and the fire eaters say it is very, very important that as we break away from the United States, we have to teach the North not to mess with slavery. So there can be no compromise. There can be no peaceful dissolution of the Union. We must have a civil war. Now, I want to talk about ethical dilemmas. I want to kind of pause the rush to war and talk about ethical dilemmas. What is more important to you, your country or your family? Okay? And we actually have the election returns from these decisions to secede. And the decision to break away from the United States was not uniform. And there are a lot of Southerners who were really quite upset when their states broke away from the United States. A substantial minority of voters went against secession, and they were very upset at this decision. They're like, my entire state has gone mad. They've listened to these crazy fire eaters, and there are now, our state is treasonous. It's filled with traitors. And not surprisingly, the people who are opposed to secession are not the rich slave-owning planters. They are the poor white farmers, generally concentrated in, the Appalachian Mountains, northern Mississippi, northern Georgia, eastern Tennessee, western Virginia. They refuse to accept secession. They say, we are not going to fight for slavery. okay? And they begin to call themselves Unionists. In fact, there's a hardcore knot of Southern Unionists in Southern Mississippi, and they actually try to break away and form a new state. This is the very famous Free State of Jones, where this group of this big chunk of Southern Mississippi just said, no, we're not traitors. We're not going to break away from the United States. We are going to be our own little state. And for the next 4 years, they fight a rebellion against the rebels who are rebelling against the federal government. And in fact, in 1863, this leads to the breakup of Virginia herself. Virginia secedes from the United States, but then the western half of Virginia breaks away and secedes from Virginia, forming an entirely new state. West Virginia becomes the 35th state, even though that wasn't their first pick for the name. They wanted to call it Kanawha. That was the first name for West Virginia, but then they eventually settled on West Virginia. So here's our ethical dilemma. I want you to imagine yourself as a Southerner, and it is 1861. And your family has listened to the fire eaters. Your family is like, yes, the South forever. We're going to break away from the United States. We're not going to listen to these crazy abolitionists and this gangly, weird-looking lawyer from Illinois who everyone is calling president. What would you do if your family and your state and if they are opposing the federal government and the federal government says these people are traitors and we're going to put down this rebellion? Would you side with your family who is going to go defend something that is completely immoral, American slavery? Or do you side with your government to fight your own family because the government's argument is that eventually their argument will be, we're going to destroy slavery. And I don't want you to have an answer right now, but I want you to think about this. If it came down to it and you had to pick a side and you had to load a rifle and you had to go into battle, would you fight for your country or for your family? And the Unionists, to a large extent, are not listened to. Only the people in West Virginia really had any clout because there are no really big, strong leaders of the Unionists in the South. There's only a single famous old man who stands up and says, all of this is wrong. And to our great credit, that is Sam Houston, the governor of Texas, the ex-president of the Republic of Texas. Texas makes the decision to secede from the Union. They go to the governor, they go to Sam Houston, and they're like, we are going to break away and join the Confederacy to defend slavery. And Sam Houston looks them in the eye and says, no. All right, I will not sign that. And he writes this huge speech. They don't let him give his speech, but it gets published anyway. And that's what Sam Houston says. To secede from the Union and set up another government would cause war. If you go to war with the United States, you will never conquer her, as she has the money and the men. If she does not whip you by guns, powder, and steel, she will starve you to death. It will take the flower of this country, the young men. In the name of the Constitution of Texas, which has been trampled upon, I refuse to take this oath. I love Texas too well to bring civil strife and bloodshed upon her. Sam Houston is the one Southern governor who refuses to join the fire eaters and refuses to join the Confederacy. And this is responded, people call him traitor, traitor. And then other people are like, dude, if there is one person in Texas you cannot call a traitor, it is Sam Houston. All right. I mean, Sam Houston is like, I fought in 3 wars. You have no idea what you're gonna do when you trigger this. You have no idea what's gonna happen. And they say, Governor Houston, if you do not sign the Articles of Secession, we will remove you from the governor's office. And Sam Houston's like, do it. Do it. I want to go down fighting. And they do it. They remove Sam Houston from the governor's office. They put into place a governor who is going to sign the Articles of Secession. And Texas joins the Confederacy. Now, Sam Houston was a really old man by this time. I mean, remember, he was a protege of Andrew Jackson. So Sam Houston has an out in this ethical dilemma. He's a really old man, okay? So Sam Houston basically just goes back to his ranch. He flies an American flag in front of his ranch. He says, I'm an American citizen till the day I die. This upsets a lot of his neighbors because like, we're Confederates now, Sam. You need to take that flag down. And he's like, no, not going to do it. But no one will force him to do it because he's bloody Sam Houston. And Sam Houston doesn't have to make this decision about whether you fight for your country or your family, because Sam Houston was an old dude and he knew death was close. And in fact, Sam Houston will never live to see the end of the Civil War. He dies in 1863. But everything that he said about the Civil War, it all comes true. Everything Sam Houston said comes true. And in fact, there's this letter that was rediscovered in the 20th century, one of these kind of great what-ifs of history. Abraham Lincoln writes a letter to Sam Houston, a retired Sam Houston, and says, look, if I land 5,000 American Marines in Galveston, will you command them and win Texas back for the United States? And Sam Houston says no. Sam Houston is, look, I'm old. I don't have to make this I don't have to make this hard call. I'm just going to be old. I'm going to be retired. I'm going to hang out on my ranch. And I don't even want to know what happens. I don't even want to know what you people do. But it's one of the great what-ifs of history. Like, what if Sam Houston would have said yes and Texas would have never really joined the Confederacy? It's one of those great what-ifs. In fact, Sam Houston is he's such an iconoclast, and he's such an American that when Abraham Lincoln actually issues the Emancipation Proclamation, Sam Houston actually calls a bunch of his slaves and he says, look, the president has freed you guys. So all of you guys are free, even though, the Union armies are hundreds of miles away. Slavery is dead in the United States. You guys can do what they want. And one of his best friends is one of these, slaves that he owns. And he says, that's really awesome. They decide to stay with the old man. And in fact, the leader of these African Americans asks Sam Houston to take can I take your last name? And Sam Houston goes, I'd be honored if you did that. And that's how Joshua Houston, who was one of Sam Houston's slaves, gets his last name. We'll come back to Joshua Houston later. The federal arsenals in the South surrender one by one, okay? Filled to the brim with rifles and cannons and gunpowder. The Southerners capture entire ships, okay? But there is a stronghold in the South that refuses to surrender. Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter refuses to surrender to South Carolina. They surround Fort Sumter with guns paid for by the United States government. And they say, if you do not surrender, we will open fire. And this is the situation, in progress when Abraham Lincoln takes office. And the leader of Fort Sumter, Robert Anderson, writes a letter to Abraham Lincoln. He's like, what am I going to do, man? We're about to run out of food. And Abraham Lincoln sends a ship that is unarmed named Star of the West. And it contains enough food and water to get them through. And what Abraham Lincoln wants to do is, are the Southerners serious about this Civil War business? And he discovers they are. The Southern batteries open fire on the Star of the West, and then they open fire on Fort Sumter. For 2 days, they bombard the fort, blasting it with cannons. You can see in the map on the left, the blue is Fort Sumter. The red are the Confederate batteries. In fact, the Confederate commander meets Edward Ruffin, the famous fire eater, and gives Edmund Ruffin the honor of firing one of the first cannons at Fort Sumter. He's very happy. He's like 68, 69. He's too old to serve, but he can fire a cannon and start the Civil War that he has longed so much for. And this raises this big historical question about the Civil War. Did slavery cause the Civil War? The answer is yes. It did. But the answer is also no. And a really honest answer is sort of. Yes, did slavery cause the Civil War? That one's very easy. Slavery caused secession, and secession caused the Civil War. That's a very easy train to follow. So if you say yes, slavery caused the Civil War, you are completely correct. However, there are those that say no, slavery did not cause the Civil War, and they are also kind of correct. Let's take that train of logic. Slavery caused secession. Secession causes the Civil War. One of the people that says you cannot make that kind of connection is Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln says this is all about secession. This is all about preserving the Union. And Abraham Lincoln says, my job is to preserve the Union. And if I can do that through freeing all of the slaves, I'll do it. If I can do that by freeing none of the slaves, I'll do that. Abraham Lincoln says this is not about slavery. It's about secession. All right. However, a much more honest answer about did slavery cause the Civil War, a much more honest answer that kind of gets into the historical messiness is sort of. That's like the most honest answer. Did slavery cause the Civil War? Sort of. I mean, it caused secession quite clearly. But as the war drags on, the issue of slavery becomes more and more and more important to the North, until by 1864, the Civil War to the North is basically this religious crusade to destroy American slavery. But in the South, as the war drags on and they start losing in a big way, slavery becomes less and less important. All right. By the time you get to 1864 or 1865 and you ask the Southerners, are you fighting for slavery? They look at you like you're crazy. They're like, this has nothing to do with slavery. This is all about defending our homes and defending our rights and defending our ability to live in peace. So when you get into the real messiness of history, you rapidly realize there is no clear answer to that question. Did slavery cause the Civil War? You should look people in the eye when they ask that and just say yes, no, and sort of. But Abraham Lincoln is going to defend the Union. Abraham Lincoln is not weak or indecisive. He's no Millard Fillmore. He's not a drunk. He's no Franklin Pierce. He's not old or senile. He's no James Buchanan. Abraham Lincoln is the kind of president that the country hadn't seen since the days of Andrew Jackson or James Polk or Thomas Jefferson. Abraham Lincoln is decisive. He is confident. He knows his job as president is to preserve the Union. Following the precedent laid down by Andrew Jackson during the nullification crisis, Abraham Lincoln says no state is allowed to leave the Union. And the South has already started shooting. The Battle of Fort Sumter is in the past. Lincoln calls for a national army. He is going to quadruple the size of the U.S. Army, 75,000 volunteers to force the South to rejoin the Union. This will quadruple the size of the U.S. military. He begins to draw up his plans for invasions of the South, and he begins to hand out a lot of blue hats because it's time to fight the Civil War. He calls upon the senior American military official, a guy called Winfield Scott, and that's him on the upper left. Winfield Scott is the old hero of the Mexican War. He's the guy who defeated Santa Anna. He's the guy that won all these battles in Mexico and occupied Mexico City. So Lincoln calls upon the commander of the army, this really old guy called Winfield Scott. He says, how do we win this war? How are we going to force the South back into the Union? Scott is 75 years old. He's obese. He's in very poor health, but his mind is just sharp as a razor. And Winfield Scott says, okay, this war is not going to be short. This war is going to take forever. It's going to take years. And you're not going to win one huge battle and defeat the South. It's going to be this long, slow process. And he unveils something called the Anaconda Plan. And he imagines a great snake. And you can see in the cartoon right up above, Scott's great snake. The Anaconda Plan has 3 parts to it. 1, the U.S. Navy is going to surround and blockade the entire South so that they can't export cotton, get money, and then import weapons from Britain, France, and the rest of Europe. 2, they're going to build a big army in Illinois and march it down the Mississippi River. Okay? That'll crack the South in half. And once the U.S. government controls everything between Chicago and New Orleans, that will put enormous pressure on the South. And the third part of the plan is to build a huge army in Washington and push south and maintain pressure on the Confederate capital of Richmond while simultaneously defending Washington, D.C. So a blockade, an invasion down the Mississippi, and pressure in Northern Virginia. This is Scott's great snake, and it's going to wrap itself around the South like a great anaconda and just squeeze the South. until the southern states shatter. All right? And Abraham Lincoln says, that sounds absolutely wonderful. When can you put this into action? Winfield Scott goes, no, I can't do this. I'm sorry, Mr. President, I'm 75 years old. I'm 450 pounds. This is not going to happen with me. I'm too old, I'm too sick, I'm just too fat to command the army. But I know the perfect person to do this. Winfield Scott recommends the best man he knows. He says, I fought with this guy down in Mexico. He was my protege. He is the best man you can have at this moment of crisis. I know the exact person you need to select to put the Anaconda Plan into action. And Abraham Lincoln says, who is this person? And Winfield Scott recommends Robert E. Lee, that whistleblower from Texas, the man who captured John Brown. And the Secretary of War, even though the Secretary of War doesn't have actual authority to do this, the Secretary of War meets with Robert E. Lee and offers Robert E. Lee total command of the U.S. military to put the Anaconda Plan into action. And Robert E. Lee says no. Here he is in an American uniform. It's a U.S. uniform. Robert E. Lee is faced with that ethical dilemma right up above. Robert E. Lee is no fan of slavery. In fact, he has published a lot of letters talking about how much he's not a huge fan of slavery. He's not going to fight a war for slavery. But he will fight to defend his home. He will fight to defend his family. Robert E. Lee has the same ethical dilemma that Sam Houston had and made the total opposite decision. Robert E. Lee turns down command of the U.S. Army. He resigns from the military and heads south to fight for Virginia. Here's the map. President Abraham Lincoln right up above me. And we're going to talk about what are the war aims of the United States. Well, to force the South back into the Union, it has to militarily invade and occupy the South. It's got to build a gigantic navy to put the Anaconda Plan into action. It's got to build hundreds and hundreds of ships. And it has to build 3 great armies. The Army of the Potomac, the Army of the Tennessee, and the Army of the Mississippi. It's going to build these 3 armies in the North. They, combined with the Navy, are going to invade and occupy the South. They're going to wrap themselves like a huge snake around the South and squeeze it until it cracks. And it's not a bad plan. It's not a bad plan at all. After all, the North has overwhelming advantages. The North has 24 states. It's got 70% of the population, 22 million people. And look at those production numbers right up above me. The North has 85% of all the factories and 96% of all the railways. The North is larger, wealthier, more industrialized, and it just has more people. It's going to outnumber and outproduce the South like crazy. The North has very real advantages to it. And the South only has 11 states. It's got a minority of the industry, a minority of the railways. But the South does have its advantages. It's got 2 really big advantages. One is the land itself, crisscrossed by mountain ridges, deep valleys, wide rivers. The terrain of the South greatly favors a strong defense. Any military invasion of the South would be a tactical and logistical nightmare. And as we'll see in the Civil War, it absolutely was. The second advantage the South had, they start with this really powerful army. The Southern Army, the Confederate Army in the beginning of the Civil War, is just as big as the Northern Army. They have this very powerful army. It's led by trained U.S. Army officers, both commissioned and non-commissioned. It's been armed and equipped by sympathetic officials from the Buchanan administration. In fact, most of Buchanan's old cabinet would in fact join the Confederacy, including his own vice president, as Breckinridge becomes this very famous Confederate general. Even the old Secretary of War, Floyd, he becomes a Confederate general. The South starts off with this really powerful military. And they have a path to victory. These are the Confederate war aims under their new president, Jefferson Davis, himself yet another hero of the Mexican War. This is how the South plans to win the war. They are going to fight a defensive war. They are going to defend these mountain ridges and valleys and wide rivers with three mighty armies: the Army of Northern Virginia, the Army of Tennessee, and the Army of Mississippi. And they're going to assemble these armies under a great Confederate flag, which is not the Confederate flag you probably think of. That in the lower left, that is the flag of the Confederacy. Now, what people generally think of as the Confederate flag is not actually the Confederate flag. That ends up being the flag of the battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia. But as the Army of Northern Virginia wins battle after battle and becomes more and more famous, people start to prefer the military flag of the Army of Northern Virginia over the actual Confederate flag. But that on the left, that's the actual Confederate flag. That is not actually the stars and bars, the crisscross. That's not actually the Confederate flag. Now, in order to confuse students 200 years later, the North names its armies after rivers, but the South names its armies after states. Now, in the East, this isn't an issue because you've got the Union Army of the Potomac, named after the Potomac River, fighting the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, named after the state. But when you get out west, then it gets really messy because you have the Union Army of the Tennessee, which is named after the river, fighting the Confederate Army of Tennessee, which is named after the state. And you'll have the Union Army of the Mississippi fighting the Confederate Army of Mississippi, named after the river and the state, respectively. And this whole time, they're like, we're going to use really quick and rapid blockade runners to trade cotton to France and Britain. And eventually, when we defeat the North, we will seek European recognition. We're going to buy a bunch of arms and equipment and cannons and warships from the British and the French. And with European recognition, we will win this civil war. And this comes to the first huge battle of the Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run, the first Battle of Bull Run. Lincoln is president. He gets a general. He explains the Anaconda strategy. And the U.S. military basically says, no, we're not going to do any of that. The Anaconda strategy is too complicated. This war is not going to last that long. We're just going to build a huge army and march to Richmond and hang Jeff Davis. So they assemble this huge army. They march it south. The Confederates build the Army of Northern Virginia. They put Joe Johnston, who was a former U.S. Army general, become a Confederate general. Under Joe Johnston, the Army of Northern Virginia moves north, and they meet at Harper's Ferry, the very place that John Brown attempted to incite that slave revolt in 1859. And the result is the complete and total carnage that is the first Battle of Bull Run. And people think this is going to be one huge battle that's going to decide the Civil War. And they think it's going to be a picnic. They think it's going to be something to watch. People leave Washington, D.C. with picnic baskets. And the hills around the battlefield are covered with people picnicking there to watch the fireworks in the battle, because none of these people know what actual war is like. And the two great armies meet at Bull Run. It's the name of the river. And they fight this brutal, bloody, horrible battle all day long. At first, it looks like the Army of Northern Virginia is going to crack, but then a hero rises up. He saves his division, a guy called Thomas Jackson. And Thomas Jackson puts his soldiers in the middle of the battle, and there they stand like a great stone wall. And that's how Thomas Jackson becomes known as Stonewall Jackson. And after attacking all morning and afternoon, the Union Army is smashed. The Confederates launch a quick counterattack, and the Army of the Potomac shatters and flees back to Washington, D.C. in total disarray. And in fact, the retreat from the first battle of Bull Run is so chaotic because in the retreating columns become intermixed with all these civilians who thought it was going to be, we're going to watch these fireworks show. And instead of being one huge battle that's going to decide, the entire war, it ends up being merely a prelude to the unprecedented levels of carnage and brutality that are going to take place over the next 4 years. Lincoln is absolutely disgusted with the way the army performed at Bull Run. So he turns to a new general, a guy called George McClellan. And he says, okay, George McClellan, you've got a really great reputation. How would you conquer the South? How about Winfield Scott's Anaconda Plan? And George McClellan is like, nah, forget that. It's too complicated. It's going to take too long. All we really need to do is win one huge battle, and then we'll win the war. And Abraham Lincoln is like, okay, George McClellan, you do it. So George McClellan goes, I'm gonna do this really great maneuver, and we're going to attack Richmond from the sea. And the result is the Peninsular Campaign of 1862. George McClellan sort of rebuilds the Army of the Potomac, and this time he's going to invade Virginia from the sea. And the Peninsular Campaign takes place between March and July of 1862. March, April, May, June, July, 5 months. And his opponent is again Joe Johnston. And he moves, as you can see, he moves the army out of Washington, down the Chesapeake Bay, lands at the James River, and it proceeds to attack the Confederate capital from the ocean. And at first, it is a tremendous success. Joe Johnston has to split his army in half. Half of it he's got to send north to keep defending Bull Run. The other half he turns to defend the peninsula. And George McClellan starts winning battle after battle after battle as he pushes Joe Johnston back towards Richmond. And in fact, it looks like the North is about to win the Civil War. The Union Army is within sight of Richmond. They can hear the church bells on Sunday. They can see the tops of the buildings on the horizon. They're that close to the Confederate capital, and they're just about to win the war when suddenly they even hit the Confederate general. And they're winning battle after battle, and Joe Johnston is running around on his horse trying to shore up his defeated army when suddenly a cannonball explodes over Joe Johnston, and a piece of shrapnel almost tears his left shoulder off. So they blow Joe Johnston off of his horse. And at this point, the Union is like, we've won this war. We're winning battle after battle. We can see the enemy capital. We just blew the Confederate general off of his horse. We've got this. But actually, wounding Joe Johnston was probably the worst thing they could have done. Because you see, in their desperation, they now need a new general to command the Army of Northern Virginia. Joe Johnston it doesn't kill him. He comes back later in the war. But Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, in his desperation, turns to, the protege of Winfield Scott, the person everyone agrees is a military genius. And he gives command to the Army of Northern Virginia to Robert E. Lee, there in his gray Confederate uniform. And he turns over the army to Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee looks at the situation and goes, I can win this. And he launches this massive battle called the Battle of the 7 Days. He divides his army again, and he divides his army a third time. And you're not supposed to do this in traditional military circles. When you're faced by a larger and more powerful enemy, you're supposed to consolidate your army, not spread it out. But what essentially Robert E. Lee does is divide his army over and over and over again and turn it from one big army into a bunch of tiny little armies, and then he attacks from every angle simultaneously. And the Union Army has no way to really know what's happening. They think Robert E. Lee's army is behind every single attack. George McClellan is thrown into a complete panic. And after battling for 7 days, the Army of the Potomac is in complete confusion. They don't know where Robert E. Lee's army is. Every time they turn, they're getting attacked from one of these small units. George McClellan issues a complete retreat. And in disarray, in confusion, the Union Army of the Potomac begins to fall back towards the coast, chased the entire way by Robert E. Lee. And as the Union Army retreats back from Richmond, Robert E. Lee pursues and starts putting all of these little armies back into one huge, unstoppable army. And they meet at the Battle of Malvern Hill, and Robert E. Lee almost destroys the entire Army of the Potomac. And he turns what was a total defeat into an outrageous Confederate victory. The Battle of 7 Days is Robert E. Lee's first tremendous victory, but it will not be his last. As he takes the Army of Northern Virginia and he wheels it around to the north to defend the Confederate capital at Richmond, and Virginia is invaded time and time and time again, and Robert E. Lee wins battle after battle after battle, as Abraham Lincoln just goes through this whole string of generals, and each of these generals think that they've got the key to defeating Robert E. Lee and winning the Civil War. They're absolutely wrong. The Army of the Potomac is defeated time after time after time. They invade Virginia for a third time and are defeated at the Second Battle of Bull Run. Robert E. Lee outflanks the Army of the Potomac and they fight a bloody draw at Antietam. There's a fourth invasion of Virginia that ends at the Battle of Fredericksburg, where yet again Robert E. Lee defeats the Army of the Potomac. They rebuild the Army of the Potomac and launch a fifth invasion of Virginia that ends in complete catastrophe at the Battle of Chancellorsville. Robert E. Lee is absolutely unbeatable. His forces move like lightning across the landscape. They think he's 50 miles away, and when the sun comes up, he's entrenched in front of them. He'll break off whole units and send them on these outflanking maneuvers. The North thinks they've got the battlefield all set up when suddenly 5,000 men will appear out of nowhere. Robert E. Lee becomes absolutely unbeatable for years, leading the Army of Northern Virginia to victory after victory after victory. And he acquires this aura of invincibility. Whole Union armies start to get thrown into panic when they just hear that Robert E. Lee is like in the area. Robert E. Lee seems absolutely unbeatable. And it's one of these great ironies of the Civil War, one of these like Civil War ironies, that the one truly great military genius that America produced, Robert E. Lee, ultimately led rebel armies against his own government. And by the end of 1863, the South is winning the Civil War. Okay, you know, in the East, the Army of Northern Virginia has just shredded the Northern Army of the Potomac 5 times. In the center, the Northern Army of the Tennessee is locked in bloody stalemate with the Confederate Army of Tennessee in the mountains and valleys of the Appalachians. Only in the West is there any sort of victory going on that we'll discuss next time, as the Army of the Mississippi has built itself an impregnable fortress at a place called Vicksburg. The Union blockade is completely transparent, and Confederate blockade runners shoot past the blockade very often, selling cotton in Europe and importing guns, weapons, and ammunition from Britain and France. By the end of 1863, the South is on the edge of victory, and Britain begins to ponder recognizing the South. British recognition is very close. If the South can win a few more victories, if it can fight on a year or two, Britain signals that it is willing to consider recognizing and militarily supporting the Confederate States of America. And this is when international relations start to become very important. France, that's their flag in the middle, France openly supports the Confederacy. France is like, we are all in favor of the Confederacy, but if we recognize and enter the war on the side of the Confederates, we don't want to do it by ourselves, all right? So France says, we will recognize the Confederacy, but only if the British do it first. So the French are ready to side with the Confederates, but they basically pass the ball to the British, and the British are ready to do it. The British are openly sympathetic to the South. There is a great deal of bonding between the British aristocracy and the Southern aristocracy. Britain is ready to do it. One of the things that gives them a little bit of pause is that a very angry Abraham Lincoln meets with the British ambassador, and he straight up says, if you help the South and if Great Britain recognizes the Confederacy, this will be an act of war against the United States. And that gives the British a little bit of pause. And then one of the weirder diplomatic events occurs when the Russian ambassador meets with the British Prime Minister, and the American ambassador is present. And the Russians say, if the French and the English enter the American Civil War, then Russia will join the Civil War on the side of the United States. So by the end of 1863, it looks like the Civil War is on the verge of becoming an international, worldwide conflict. Things are very, very dangerous. And Great Britain and the British Empire are not willing to quite trigger this really massive worldwide conflagration of Britain and France and the Confederacy against Russia and the United States. So Britain decides, okay, we are going to support the South, but we're going to do it very low key. We're going to do it very underhandedly. What we're going to do is we're going to sell weapons and guns and cannons and equipment to the South, but it's all going to be done unofficially. So Britain ends up basically arming the Confederate armies when those old US weapons start to run out. In fact, Great Britain begins to build entire warships for the Confederacy. In fact, that's one of them right up ahead, the very famous CSS Alabama, which was a British-built warship equipped and armed by the British with Confederate officers in charge of British sailors. They arm it, they build it, they equip it, it sets sail, and as soon as it's in international waters, the British flag goes down and the Confederate flag goes up. And then, you know, the CSS Alabama just absolutely wreaks havoc on the US military, you know, for the next 2 or 3 years. And one of the things preventing Britain from siding with the Confederates are the abolitionists of Great Britain itself, who do not want to be part of anything that defends slavery. But the war's not about slavery. That's what President Lincoln says. Now, you should be getting closer to having an answer to that question right up above my head. Was the American Civil War the final triumph of liberty over slavery, or a national tragedy of a failed political and economic system? Examine the outbreak and conduct of the war from one of those two perspectives. Was war inevitable? Could Lincoln have won without resorting to total war? Was all of the death and destruction visited on the South justified? Does the messy post-war period change your perspective? Now, you have about half of the information you need to answer that question, and I'm going to give you the other half in the next lecture. And I will see you there.